Welcome, everyone. We've been talking about the Civil War, and now it's time to move on to Reconstruction. Now, I've given you the traditional dates of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, but some historians talk about a long Reconstruction period. They basically are covering not just the period that Reconstruction was happening, but the unraveling of the laws of this period as well. So now you can see some different dates, but as you know, I'm not really picky about dates, so you're not going to have to memorize that. Also, remember that this is a period where we get 3 constitutional amendments very quickly. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment, providing citizenship for the former slaves and protection of their equal rights, and then the 15th Amendment, which provided the vote for Black men. The federal government ruled that for the southern states to re-enter the Union, to have full status and to be able to send politicians to the federal government, to Congress, they needed to agree to these laws. So that actually was about a 5-year process, but all of the southern states technically agreed to these different amendments and are readmitted by 1870. Now, it's probably not too surprising that the South was not too much in favor of these laws. And part of what they're going to do is to claim that the federal government doesn't have the right to interfere. This actually was worrying to some northern politicians as well. This was a real expansion of federal rights and power in order to try to make sure that these laws were enforced. So one set of laws during this period is the Enforcement Acts. In the Enforcement Acts, there's 3 major ones, but the big issue is the argument that the federal government needed to enforce these rights because the politicians and the government, the police force in the South was not doing that. So that means that the federal government has the right to supervise the elections in the South. They also have the right to have federal troops to make sure that Black men are able to go to the polls, to try to make sure that Blacks are protected. That is, it is an extension of the federal government's power, but this was argued that this was needed because without it, and as we shall see, there will be a major rollback of these rights. Now, one of the interesting things is that during the period of Reconstruction, there actually are very quickly African Americans who are voted to Congress. So there are 16 African American congressmen that served during this period. That's not a huge amount, but it's amazing how that you can go from having Blacks be enslaved to having these formerly enslaved Blacks serve in Congress. Now, unfortunately, things are going to move backwards very quickly. Remember, one of the things we're talking in this class is these kind of developments of rights, who gets these rights, of freedom and equality. And so as we move through Reconstruction, you're already going to start to see these being rolled back. So first of all, it's important to remember that in the South, the white supremacists really want to return to the former system. Now, they can't go to the system that will have they can no longer enslave Blacks, so that can't happen. But that doesn't mean that they are going to regard Blacks as equal to them. And they are going to do everything they can to undermine this. So first of all, they do a huge propaganda campaign against the Black politicians. They argue that they're corrupt, they don't know what they're talking about. Clearly, because of the fact that they're not equal to whites, they're not able to do their job well. And so in the newspapers, you see this huge campaign against Black politicians. Second, very early in Reconstruction, we start to see violence being used. And this violence is going to come in a couple different ways. First of all, there's just mob violence, riots against Blacks. There's a lot of accusations that Blacks are committing crimes and different things, and so this needs to be done. We get the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Ku Klux Klan has some different phases in American history, but this is the starting of the Klan. The Klan is founded by a series of a group of Confederate veterans in order to try to police and preserve the South. The Klan is probably the most well-known of the groups, but there are others as well during this period. And finally, we begin to see lynching. Now, the idea here is it's a take on the mob violence or the mob justice, these people would say, that some people, and amazingly they're always Black, are committing heinous crimes, and therefore there's no time to work this through the justice system. These people need to be just taken out and hung. And there's very disturbing photographs from this period that oftentimes this is always done in front of crowds. This isn't done secretly, that you have the crowds there, they're cheering, they're excited about what is happening. Now, again, those who were doing these lynchings argued that they were not signaling out Blacks, that this way would do this same type of violence for anyone who committed crimes, but all the victims are Black. And the juries will not convict. So there really is basically no conviction, even though it's very clear who's doing this. I mean, it's done in front of a crowd. But in that sense, the Southern juries will never convict. That means you're creating an atmosphere of fear. Not only are you physically stopping Blacks from coming to the polls or exercising their rights, but on top of that, there's the fear of what might happen. Now, normally you kind of say that Reconstruction officially ends in 1877. Now, the Compromise of 1877 has to happen because of a very controversial presidential election. There's a disagreement over the allocation of electoral college votes. Remember, in the US, we don't vote directly for our president. We vote for electors who vote for our president. And there's disagreement, there's accusations that some of the electoral college votes are not being allocated correctly. A commission is formed. Anyways, it ends up so that President Hayes has one more electoral college vote than his opposition. But there's potentially this is going to drag on and be a real issue. So basically, they come up with this compromise. So the Democrats are going to recognize Hayes as the U.S. president. But in return, the federal government has to withdraw its troops from the South and has to stop trying to enforce Reconstruction. So that Reconstruction, these laws that were trying to protect Black rights and to make sure that the Blacks had protection on equal rights under the law. So basically from 1877, things get only worse. So just keep in mind the violence is happening even before the Compromise of 1877, but now things are just getting worse and worse. So first of all, in the South, you get gerrymandering of voting districts. So they're going to draw the lines in voting districts in really weird ways in order to make sure that there are no Black majorities. Because in districts where Blacks are the majority, you would be much more likely to get Black politicians. And the argument is that shouldn't happen. They also would put in poll taxes. Basically, you have to pay to vote. And while this does hit some white Southerners as well, poor white Southerners, it's really aimed at the Blacks. And then we get the beginning of the Jim Crow laws, the idea that Blacks have to ride in certain parts of the bus, they're not allowed to go into certain buildings. We begin this huge issue of segregation. These laws are all passed after 1877. And really the nail in the coffin is going to be a case that goes to the Supreme Court in 1896. So this is Plessy versus Ferguson. And the big issue here is that the Supreme Court rules that separate but equal is legal. Okay, so we're going to have separate but equal. And the argument here is this actually is not anti-Black. If you have two schools and one is fully white and one is fully Black, they should then be equal in their funding and the quality and things. Of course, none of that happens, but the idea is here. So basically, by 1896, the situation is in play that's going to be there until we hit the 1950s and 60s with the civil rights movement. So this very quick period then from 1865 to 1877, when at least there are these new amendments that are coming to the Constitution and laws passed, the federal government's trying to enforce them. And then after 1877, a full rollback. And in fact, in many southern states, this is enshrined now in their constitutions and in the law.